Resilience and resiliency. The capacity to recover quickly from difficulties, and also a toughness. The ability of a substance or a community or a person to spring back into shape. Psychology today describes resilience this way. Resilience is that ineffable quality that allows some people to be knocked down by life and come back stronger than ever. Rather than letting failure overcome them and drain their resolve, they find a way to rise from the ashes. In a nutshell, resilience can be defined as the ability and the tendency to bounce back. So resilient faith in the face of adversity. I could add our definition, and you can add that into the psychology today, is that resilience is that ineffable quality that allows a church to be knocked down by life but come back stronger than ever rather than letting failure overcome. Our lessons today speak to us of such a movement of resiliency in the face of adversity for the sake of the gospel of Jesus Christ. So let's talk about resiliency in the face of Job-like challenges, or let's talk about resiliency in the face of a hostile and hateful world, Paul-like challenges. And let's talk about the challenge of resiliency and the fears found in the eye of the storm of the disciples, like fear for the presence of Jesus. So in our lessons today, we find Job, who loses everything and is tested, and then he meets God, and then there's Job's complaint, and then God declares that Job's perspective is weak and his mind is clouded in the face of God's redemptive and creative and sanctifying power, even in the midst of unspeakable loss and fair weather friends. Job is still in the presence of God in the midst of his adversity and despair. Paul suffers all for the sake of Christ. For his mission is clear, and he's not alone, as our lessons depict. Courage in the face of adversity and such resiliency is found again and again and again in the early Jesus people, the early Jesus movement. In the face of religious and political persecution, but all for the sake of the world and the gospel, you find a group of people, a community of deep resilience. So all the characters in our stories today, in our lessons, through all their adversity, they are resilient. They persevere. But the gospel is a movement through and to. It's through all the complaints that may arise or excuses we may have, and to the redemption of the world. We're a bounce-back church then, and this is my point. So what about us? Should we say that we are doomed and abandon all hope to ye who enter into this time of emerging from COVID, or finding ourselves having to pivot or shift as a church called St. Matthew's? For we are a resilient church, and I guess I wanted to lay that word upon you and let you ponder it and meditate upon your resiliency in the face of adversity. God calls her church to be steadfast. And do not let fear get the best of you, our lessons say. Turn to Jesus and cry out, save us, and then turn to one another and say, I've got your back. And then turn to the world and say, we're here in the name of amazing love, and we're not going anywhere. May we join you. Facing our fears and our anxieties and our excuses, we are a resilient church. Paul lays it out. As we work together with him, we urge you not to accept the gospel of God in vain. See, now is the acceptable time. See, now is the day of salvation. And so again, I will repeat, resilience, resilience, resilience. We must embrace that word, let it sink deep into our bones as a church and as disciples of Jesus. Because we see in our gospel, in our gospel lesson, these disciples are seasoned fishermen, are they not? And they know the sea, and yet they're lost so much in the fear and their terror in the midst of the storm, even while Jesus is with them. And even in the midst of such a storm, they cry out to Jesus, so there's a relationship there, even in the midst of their fear and anxiety and their worry and their terror. And even in the midst of that, their faith, even the size of a mustard seed, as we learned last week, is ultimately present. They had just enough strength to cry out to Jesus, who is with them all the time. So just as we proclaim in our burial worship, in the Book of Common Prayer, we go down to the dust, yet even at the grave, we make our song, Alleluia, Alleluia, Alleluia. If that's not a resilient, resounding proclamation, then I don't know what is, in the face of death and the grave. So Jesus the Christ comes and breathes peace in the midst, even as we are assailed by storms in our life. This is where we shift and pivot to our lives and how we find ourselves facing adversity, or as a church as well. And we are tempted to lose faith, and ultimately facing the storms and the chaos, we can be more focused on our fears than Jesus. Jesus' patience and love for us is perfect peace, even when we lose sight of the shore. Jesus as the non-anxious presence always wins the day. So all of this resiliency is on the way, moving forward, moving through, dynamic, mission-focused, even in the midst of our temptations to surrender to the dark, even in the midst of loss, hostility, uncertainty, fear, and danger. We are all in the same boat together. And we know the terror of the storms, and yet God speaks to us as God spoke to Job in the midst of the whirlwind of his confusion and his despair, to remind us that we are not alone. So Jesus wakes up and rebukes the wind and said, "Peace, be still," and turns to his disciples and say, "Why are you afraid? Have you still no faith?" That must be our question. So let's talk about resiliency, apply our lessons to our lives, and St. Matthew's Episcopal Church. We come to Job in the way of suffering, yet God's steadfastness. We come to Paul in the way of mission, in the face of hostility, yet God's strength. And then we come to Jesus, the way of calm and in the midst of confusion and fear and anxiety. Disciples are humbled in the face of the power of Christ. So we must as well. For we, as a church of Jesus Christ, are a resilient community. We have shown that over the years. St. Matthew's isn't going anywhere. Look how far we've come. So whatever we face, wherever our landing pad is, wherever we land together. And then we are called, nonetheless, in the midst of confusion and anxiety and fear in this world, to be a non-anxious presence, a presence of peace, a presence of hope and love. So we emerge from the pandemic stronger and more resilient. We realize that our faith must lead us into the storms of this world, into the lives of those who, like Job, are suffering loss or wounds and bad advice. So how are you doing these days? How is your faith these days? How shall we be resilient? What has changed? What must stay the same? So I say, let us choose to be such resiliency. Let us be disciples of Jesus that face adversity with faith for the sake of the love of others. To hear others say, look at those Jesus people at St. Matthew's. See how they are committed to loving all, even when they are faced with adversity. Even in the midst of such, they bring courage and they bring faith to bear. See how resilient they are.